On April 19th, 1775, shots rang out at Lexington. By October 19th, 1781, Cornwallis surrendered at Yorktown, but many records were struck through in red. One letter addressed to the general when the time comes was sealed and never opened. What else was left unread? A spoon engraved J.H., a portrait hidden, a page missing. Between 1775 and 1781, names were crossed out of ledgers, portraits torn from taverns, and uniforms buried in ash. When independence was won, what else was lost to silence? Welcome to History's Ledger. This is not a channel about battles alone. It is about what wars leave behind. The torn pages, the hidden portraits, the letters never opened. The American Revolution was written in fire and ink, but it was also written in silence. Tonight, we will read that silence. April 18th, 1775. Boston smelled of smoke, salt, and damp wool, hung too long in crooked alleys. Lanterns swung overhead, casting gold slices across shuttered windows. In a tavern near King Street, a knife cut against wood. Letter by letter, the name of George III was carved away. The crown above it lingered, then splintered. Across town, General Gage's men polished muskets in silence. Bayonets gleamed on tables rubbed with beeswax. Orders whispered. Concord held arms. March before dawn. In one house on Milk Street, a coat was lifted from its peg. Brass buttons caught firelight. A woman fastened them. Her husband nodded. No words. Lexington still slept. Hearth smoke drifted low. Rain left black crescents in the grass. The bell rope trembled, not yet rung, but hooves already struck cobblestone. Revere leaned forward, cloak snapping. Behind him, doors. Then Prescott. Sparks on the road. In a parlor west of town, a tea set waited. Porcelain thin as eggshell. A silver spoon, engraved J.H., chimed against a dish. A plum ribbon lay folded nearby. Fragile. Still there. Militia gathered on Lexington Green. Young men clutched powder horns. The old leaned on muskets polished smooth. Their breath came white in the cold. Bells began to toll, not for prayer. The redcoats moved out before midnight. Flints clicked. Drums muttered. Their coats, mist damp, smelled of dye and sweat. Marching boots sank into mud past houses where windows cracked open, then closed again. At first light, Lexington. Smoke curled above the green. The first musket cracked. No one agreed who fired it. What lingered was silence, broken only by the moan of the wounded. Blood smeared thresholds. A mother pressed linen to her son's side. The fabric darkened. Linen, once a symbol of virtue, now bore only stain. At Concord's North Bridge, smoke stung eyes. The river rippled with morning light, streaked with oil from discharged muskets. Horses reared. The smell of powder clung to hands and hair. On the retreat to Boston, Minutemen fired from thickets and stone walls. Each report left silence, then another crack. By dusk, the road reeked of churned earth and powder. Redcoats staggered, soaked with sweat and rain. Smoke rose faint from barns where doors had been broken. In Boston that night, crates were nailed shut. Inside, more than weapons. Diaries, tea sets, silver spoons, a child's glove, a portrait of George III, not burned, but wrapped in cloth and slid under a floorboard. Elsewhere, a letter passed hand to hand. The seal glowed red. To the general, when the time comes. It was never opened. The first day of revolution ended, not with declaration, but fragments. A blood-stained ribbon, a hidden portrait, a spoon engraved, a letter unread. The fire had begun. Its shadow, even from the start, was silence. Philadelphia, May 1775. The city smelled of horses, damp wool, and candle wax. Inside the Pennsylvania State House, the Second Continental Congress gathered. Quills hovered above blank parchment, linen cravats stiff with starch, coats still dusted from the road, and eyes darkened by news from Lexington. John Hancock presided. John Dickinson whispered of reconciliation. Jefferson scribbled on scraps, his handwriting impatient. Bells tolled outside, echoing through brick alleys. Children chased hoops past taverns thick with pipe smoke. On July 5th, Congress signed the Olive Branch Petition. Folded carefully, sealed in red wax, it was carried to the docks. That same day, another document emerged. The Declaration of the Causes and Necessity for Taking Up Arms. One letter sought peace, the other prepared for war. Two ships sailed east. One carried parchment still scented with wax. The other bore bodies from Bunker Hill, redcoats wrapped in cloth, families carrying silver cups and prayer books. The smell on board was salt and grief. By August, the dead arrived in London before the words. The king read of peace while the court still wore mourning. On August 23, 1775, George III declared the colonies in rebellion. In Boston, reinforcements had already landed. Howe, Clinton, and Burgoyne stepped onto wet planks. The waterfront reeked of tar and fish. Curtains shifted in windows. Some families packed portraits of the king into crates. Others hung them higher. Whispers moved through parlors. A letter had crossed the ocean, not to the king, but to a general. To the general when the time comes. It remained sealed. Tea was poured in parlors, while militiamen drilled outside. Silver spoons clinked softly, while powder-stained fingers reloaded muskets. Fire and refinement flickered side by side. That winter, snow lay heavy across New England. Sails froze in harbor. In taverns, men read the King's proclamation by candlelight. Voices cracked as they spoke of fire and judgment. In Virginia, a widow wept into lace trimmed in French embroidery. The petition sat unopened. The ledgers showed signatures, but the war had chosen smoke. Boston, June 16th, 1775. Smoke from kitchens drifted over lanes slick with brine and tar. Children pressed noses to shutters, listening for bells. Across the Charles River, militia took position on Breed's Hill. By lantern light, they dug into soil that smelled of wet clay and cut grass. At dawn, Gage ordered the assault. Boats creaked across the water, redcoats gleaming even in haze. General Howe led them forward. Sun flashed on brass buckles and bayonets. The river smelled of mud and gun oil. From rooftops in Boston, families watched. Mothers pressed lace to their mouths, the cloth scented with lavender water. Fingers clutched lockets, spoons, miniature portraits. Luxury held in shaking hands. The red line advanced. Drums thudded low. At Breed's Hill, the militia waited. Israel Putnam shouted to hold fire. Powder horns were nearly empty. The air thickened. Muskets cracked. Smoke rolled, sharp and bitter, stinging eyes. The smell of powder soaked every thread of wool. Redcoats fell. Boots slipped in grass. Still they pressed forward, again and again. The hill turned red. In Boston, the roar echoed against wood and glass. Windows shattered. Smoke drifted down streets where silversmiths still displayed polished candlesticks. Inside, refinement. Outside, collapse. By night, the wounded lay on floors near the wharf. The air reeked of sweat and blood. Linen tore into bandages. On one stairwell, a young soldier dropped a letter. The seal smeared in blood. No one read it. A diary read, "The smoke lingers. The bells are hushed. The dead lie in rows. No names, only absence. Ships prepared to sail for London. Coffins sealed. Trunks filled with portraits. Gloves, silver cups. A crate rattled with a child's ivory toy. The smell of salt and mourning mingled. In London, the dead arrived before the plea. The olive branch petition followed, unread, too late. On Boston streets, fire wrote its own ledger. A pewter cup, dented by musket shot, was pulled from rubble and set on a mantel. A mahogany chair survived in one cellar, velvet scorched, still soft beneath ash. In another house, a portrait of the king hung crooked, too heavy to move. The hill was taken, but what endured weren't names, it was fragments. The revolution's archive, written in ash. In a room thick with heat and candle smoke, hands were raised, voices cracked. The vote passed. By evening, ink dried too fast on parchment spread across mahogany. Jefferson's words, sharp, measured, final, were copied by candlelight. 2 days later, bells rang until palms blistered and the streets of Philadelphia trembled with sound. Across the colonies, the words traveled faster than certainty. In New York, soldiers stood under thunderclouds. The declaration was read aloud, every syllable carried across a field dusted with powder. Cheers erupted, muskets lifted, then silence fell again. Nearby, the statue of George III still stood on Bowling Green, gilt, mounted, royal. Ropes flew, metal groaned. The king toppled into dirt. Children hacked at the fragments with hatchets. The lead was melted into musket balls. A monarch turned into war. But not every image was struck down. In Boston, portraits were wrapped in holland cloth and hidden under floorboards. Too precious to destroy, too dangerous to display. Their silence lasted longer than the crowds. Taverns filled with noise and smoke. Mugs clinked against pewter. A quill rested beside an unfinished letter. The ink spread, pooling like blood. Farmhouses echoed with voices reading words once meant only for the halls of power. Children copied phrases onto slates, their chalked fingers trembling. Some whispered the lines like scripture, others like rebellion. In London, disbelief hung over Parliament. The words arrived weeks too late. Ministers muttered behind polished tables. Outside, the king's likeness still stared down from signs and frames. No ropes there, no fire, no molten lead. Back in the colonies, the words were spoken. Then the voices quieted. One statue smashed, one portrait hidden, one parchment folded and passed from hand to hand. The revolution had found its voice, but silence, careful and lasting, kept what words could not. Mist clung low to the Hudson as red leaves floated on cold water. Burgoyne's army moved south, uniforms trimmed in braid, champagne packed in crates, silver glinting in saddlebags. He expected a campaign. He brought a dining table. Across the hills, the American camp built fires. Gates stood at the head, firm, diplomatic. Arnold paced at the edges, restless. Their soldiers wore patched coats, shoes split at the toe. Powder horns clinked against belt buckles rubbed smooth by time. Smoke rose first at Freeman's farm. Gunfire snapped through the trees. Burgoyne's redcoats moved in lines, bright and disciplined, even through haze. Arnold charged, reckless. His voice tore through the din. 3 weeks later, the air shifted again. At Bemis Heights, he disobeyed orders, rode into the field, and was shot in the leg. The boot filled with blood. He fell into canvas while the army pushed forward without him. When the British surrendered, 6,000 muskets were stacked in rows, barrels gleaming in grey light. Drums thudded as flags lowered. The valley held its breath. In London, the news hit polished mahogany tables beneath chandeliers heavy with wax. Fingers tapped at maps. Words like surrender, casualties, and retreat appeared in ink. But the name that had led the charge was missing. Arnold lay in his tent, wounded, forgotten. Reports praised Gates. Muster rolls crossed through Arnold's line in ink. His victory disappeared before it could be remembered. What remained were not reports, but objects. a powder horn carved with initials, unearthed decades later, a musket ball flattened against a tree, kept in a drawer, a fork taken from Burgoyne's baggage listed in a Vermont estate. The stories lived in things no one meant to keep. Arnold's bitterness grew while the valley went quiet. His silence deepened, pages blacked out before the ink dried. France joined the war in celebration of the American win. Ships left too long, loaded with powder and brandy. Yet, in the forest near Saratoga, the loudest echo was absence, a name erased, a wound that didn't heal, and a field where silence outlasted victory. The river had begun to ice when the army reached the valley. Frost crusted the grass, and boots tore through snow until the leather split. Feet bled. The wind carried smoke, vinegar, and the sour bite of sickness. Huts went up one by one. Logs stacked quickly. Mud sealed the gaps. Inside, straw-covered dirt floors. Blankets were thin. Vermin came early. In the general's quarters, plaster walls held a chill. A clock ticked faintly above Washington's desk. Letters from Paris lay open beside a decanter of Madeira. The ink smelled of smoke and perfume. The silence in the room said more than any reply. Out in the lines, men boiled bark into bread. Tents sagged. A surgeon's tent reeked of vinegar and steam. Linen boiled in kettles until black water hissed through the cracks. At night, gunfire cracked from the woods. Somewhere, a boy coughed until his breath caught. "Sleep, Tom," someone whispered. "If you can." Washington walked among them, his blue coat stiff with frost, his voice low. Soldiers rose to salute with cracked hands and hollow eyes. He nodded, said little. The cold said enough. Steuben arrived in February. His uniform smelled of camphor and salt. He barked in German, translated into French by Lafayette. "Again," he snapped, until movements sharpened. Muskets lifted and fell like breath. Discipline took shape where hope had thinned. One French officer spread a cloth on a splintered table. A silver sword-shaped letter opener gleamed faintly. The gift from Paris shimmered like promise. No one touched it, but all of them looked. By spring, Valley Forge had left its record. A coat patched with bonnet ribbon, a powder horn carved with a name lost to fever, a diary smudged by snowmelt, its last line blurred and unreadable. Most of the men who marched away would never return to that valley. The huts would rot, the fields would clear, but the silence would remain. Discipline had come, so had scars, and something else, darker, older, had settled in the snow. The quiet certainty that freedom would ask more than fire. Wind pushed hard against the hulls off Toulon. French sails bellied, powder, muskets, casks of brandy groaned in the hold. Officers in lace cuffs studied maps inked with names they'd never seen. Charleston, Philadelphia, Saratoga. In Versailles, Chandeliers shivered in their chains. Chocolate cooled in porcelain cups. Franklin sat in plain brown cloth among men in brocade, his hair untied, his eyes sharp. He spoke softly, and every word landed like gunfire in a velvet room. News from Saratoga had changed everything. February 1778. A treaty signed. France recognized the United States. Wax sealed the document. Couriers ran for the ships. Across the sea, mud thickened around boots at Valley Forge. Baron von Steuben swore in German. Lafayette translated. Soldiers raised muskets, dropped them, tried again. The drills were rhythm. Repetition became belief. One journal entry was brief. Bread makes us ill. Vermin sleep beside us. But the word is France. In taverns from Newport to Charleston, mugs lifted high, ales spilled. The smell was sweat, hope, and disbelief. Some whispered caution. Would the French bleed with us, or simply watch? London reeled. Maps unrolled in candlelit halls. Ministers marked ports from Bengal to Boston. Empires had grown on sugar and sails, and now everything tilted. Washington received Franklin's letter in a room still damp with March rain. He said nothing, but those near him watched the way his hand paused on the page. Outside, boots steamed near the fire. Inside, Madeira waited on the desk, untouched. The war had grown. In Charleston, ships unloaded crates that smelled of lavender and salt. In Philadelphia, silver forks from Paris clinked against wooden bowls. Lace stitched in lion was packed beside gunpowder. Two worlds now moved as one. Yet in quiet homes, the ledger stayed uneven. Bibles still closed over blank pages. Letters from France read aloud, then tucked away in drawers beside unpaid bills. The alliance glittered, but it was built on both promise and desperation. And beneath the fireworks, the silk, the wine, the silence hadn't left. It simply wore perfume now, with time/place fully woven into the flow. Spain entered quietly in 1779. No declarations, just ships repositioned, maps redrawn, silences lengthened. The war stretched outward, across the Caribbean, down the Mississippi, into Gibraltar's stone, and across scorched Carolina fields. At Westminster, ministers leaned over maps by candlelight. Sugar Islands, Florida, India. The empire's seams frayed faster than ink could catch them. Yet in Massachusetts, the silence deepened. One diary ended mid-line. The bells rang for Spain's entry. They say it is for our cause, no more. The rest of the page was blank. In New Orleans, Bernardo de Galvez dined on silver flatware. Wine darkened the crystal. Lace pulled at his cuffs. Reports lay beside candied fruit. He planned campaigns while couriers waited outside. Mud on boots. News of men drowned in swamps. that smelled of gunpowder and decay. In the Carolinas, loyalist raids tore through fields. Barns burned, crates were sealed in cellars, a locket, a portrait, porcelain cups wrapped in linen. One chest was bricked behind a wall. It has never been found. In London, newspapers spoke of gold and muskets, but not vanished pages or sealed letters. The ledgers recorded strategy, not absence. Aboard a ship on the Delaware, among kegs and crates, a carved box arrived from Paris. Inside, a painted clock, its hands still ticking after the crossing. Washington kept it near his papers. It marked each hour as the war widened. From upstate New York, a soldier wrote, "The pines held smoke like a veil. I walked among the fallen. I found no names, only initials carved into horns. The world tilted further. Battles reached Havana, Pensacola, Mobile. But in American homes, mothers boiled linen. Shirts hung stiff on lines. Lavender sachets were pressed between drawers, holding letters never answered. The revolution was now global, but in its corners, mystery remained. A diary left open, a trunk never recovered, a crate sealed and forgotten, a silence too deep for paper. Mist rose from the Hudson. The stone walls at West Point watched the river bend. Below, candlelight flickered through the shutters of a garrison room. A letter lay folded beside a pewter cup, its wax seal dark red. No signature, only instructions. It was meant for a British officer, Major John Andre. The man behind it was Benedict Arnold. His legs still ached from Saratoga. The boots stained from that day had never quite cleaned. His coat, once brilliant, frayed at the cuffs. On his desk, a silver inkstand, a French snuff box, a miniature of his wife in an ivory frame. Luxury whispered while silence gathered. That night, Andre stepped ashore carrying the letter, his boots in hand, papers hidden in linen. They met in a quiet room, the candlelight small. "Here," Arnold said, sliding the sealed pages across the table. By morning, it unraveled. Andre was captured near Tarrytown. The papers discovered ink, maps, notes, enough to name betrayal. Arnold fled by river. The oars slapped water slick with dawn. West Point remained American. Andre was hanged on October 2nd. Witnesses recalled his calm. He held a white handkerchief. The rope creaked. The silence afterward was longer than the drop. Arnold's name disappeared quickly. Muster rolls struck it through. Reports praised Saratoga without saying who led. His name faded like breath on glass. Objects remembered better. Andre's pocket watch stopped at the hour of his arrest. Arnold's snuff box, enamel chipped. The map they shared folded and sharp with creases. In Philadelphia, rumors traveled faster than letters. "He sold us," someone whispered behind a fan. One newspaper printed his name once, then stopped. The mistake had already begun at Saratoga, when his victory was left unnamed. But it ended here, in ink struck through, in a name removed not by bullet, but by pen. Some betrayals are loud, others vanish beneath silence. Rain clung to the fields as fog crept in from the river. Cannons had fired for days. Now the earth steamed beneath broken cornstalks and trampled trenches. The redoubts around Yorktown sagged under smoke and silence. Washington walked the line, his boots heavy with clay. Near him, Rochambeau moved in quiet, the silk lining of his cloak darkened by ash. French drums tapped in the distance. American gun crews leaned on barrels still warm. At night, lanterns flickered behind makeshift barricades. In kitchens long abandoned, tables were set with plates blackened by soot. A spoon still rested in one of them, tarnished but upright. Cornwallis did not come to the surrender. His illness was real or convenient, no one was sure. He sent General O'Hara in his place. The sword passed through hands like ceremony, held at arm's length. October 19th, 1781. No speech, just the thud of boots and drums low and steady. One account noted the British ranks silent, their eyes on nothing, their flags folded, their bayonets tilted toward the ground. The only thing louder than the drums was what wasn't said. In Washington's weather log, there is no entry for that day, no temperature, no wind direction, just a blank. Whether torn or forgotten, the absence stands, a moment too large or too quiet to reduce to numbers. Back in camp, pewter plates clinked against rough tables. Wine was poured, but not in celebration. A French officer later wrote, "We drank, but softly." There was no music. What was left behind after the guns fell silent? A scorched shoe sole at the edge of a trench, a torn map missing its corner, a diary with 2 blank pages between entries, and a wooden crate packed hastily with silver cups, musket balls, and a child's ribbon. Victory came, yes, but even the final blow came muffled. No grand finale, no clear signature, just stacked muskets and the slow unraveling of an empire. The war was nearly over, but the silence, the one that followed Yorktown, that moved through crates, across burned fields, into sealed letters, that remain. And if that silence still speaks to you, tell me, would you have written the temperature in the logbook, or left it blank like Washington did? Leave your answer in the comments, and if this chapter held something worth keeping, like, subscribe, and we'll turn the next page together. The war had shifted, but not yet closed. Fields lay empty beneath low skies. In Virginia, chimneys stood like blackened sentinels above rooms open to weather. The smell of wet ash lingered longer than smoke. Boston streets were quieter. Beneath worn floorboards, portraits still lay hidden, sealed in crates and never removed. No one dared hang them again, but no one dared destroy them either. Silence protected more than memory. In Charleston, churches remained boarded, pews gathered dust. In one sanctuary, a musket leaned against the pulpit. no sermons returned. Yet, near the altar, wrapped in yellowing cloth, someone had left a silver chalice. It caught the light through cracked glass and returned it faintly. In a Pennsylvania farmhouse, a diary stopped mid-line. We dress for worship, though the roof leaks. The bread is scarce. They say the war is done. The page that followed was blank. In drawing rooms, Madeira was poured back into crystal. Clocks were wound, curtains re-hemmed. In the same rooms, firewood was stacked over the scars in the floor, and no one asked what had once stood there. Graves appeared without names. Letters arrived without return addresses. Ledgers reopened, but entire families were gone from the lists. From New Jersey came a letter. Our barn is gone. The Bible singed. The spoon with my name is all that remains. The ink trembled at the end. Objects survived with no story left to hold them. In New York, auctions sold spoons engraved with initials no clerk could match. In Providence, a mirror cracked across the center reflected a room now filled by strangers. One trunk reached Halifax, broken open by storm. Another reached London, mislabeled, its contents swapped. A ribbon, a book, a locket with no lock. Luxury remained. Camphor-scented fabric reappeared in salons. Porcelain returned from France, even as ceilings still leaked. The sound of card games resumed before the echoes of cannon had faded entirely. Not all wounds were visible. Baptismal ledgers showed names struck through. One line read, "Removed." That was all. In Virginia, a girl wore a gown her mother had hidden through the war. She wore it once, then folded it away again. In New York, loyalists left quietly. Ships carried portraits, snuff boxes, ivory miniatures. One crate held 3 spoons engraved ED. The family's name was lost. There was no national ceremony, no final sentence. Only the slow, uneven return to structure. Doors reopened, walls were painted, but silence took up residence in the corners. The question lingered in every house still standing. What had been saved and what had been erased? Rumors moved faster than couriers. Word of the treaty crept into parlors and taverns as winter cracked into spring. By the time the ink dried in Paris, streets in Boston and Philadelphia still smelled of smoke, damp cellars, and slow rot beneath floorboards. The war had ended, but its voice hadn't returned. In Boston, sails moved again. Dock workers shouted names. Crates were lifted with the creak of hemp and wet timber. Beneath one home, a crate packed in 1776 still lay untouched, its contents wrapped in Holland cloth. A portrait, a ribbon, a set of porcelain cups never unwrapped. No one had gone looking. In Philadelphia, the State House buzzed with men in coats powdered anew, voices raised in optimism. But outside, soldiers lingered without pay. Riots flared. Muskets pointed not at redcoats, but at Congress. The street echoed with familiar footsteps, but this time without clarity. New York, still held by the British until the final days of 1783, braced under fog. Families packed their belongings in silence, silver spoons, gilt-framed portraits, ivory toys, items listed on ship manifests simply as household effects. Names were not included. Luxury moved forward. In Charleston, a widow unpacked French fabric her husband had hidden through years of siege. She wore the dress once, then folded it away again. Its perfume had changed. At Mount Vernon, Washington returned to rooms quiet with polish. Cedar oil lingered in the air. Horses clicked on stone outside. His study was lit with weak winter light, and though his servants moved softly behind him, the house remained solemn. A guest later wrote, "The air was sweet with oranges, but still, it felt as if the walls held something unsaid." In Paris, the treaty was signed under gilded ceilings. Chandeliers reflected ink-stained fingers, and the sound of sealing wax snapping into place echoed off stone walls. Outside, it rained. Church bells rang back home, but the notes fell uneven. Some stretched too long, some struck too hard. Even celebration had forgotten how to speak properly. A soldier's journal, kept since 1776, ended with the line, "They say the war is over. I do not feel it." The next page was blank. One page in Washington's weather log is missing again. As though he too didn't know how to record the air of peace. What remained were fragments, a cup rewrapped and shelved, a portrait never rehung. Victory had been declared, independence secured, but in hallways, in ledges, beneath floorboards, silence stayed. Ships crowded New York Harbor. Masts rose against gray sky, sails pulled stiff by autumn wind. The docks were thick with crates marked only by initials. Some families carried portraits wrapped in holland cloth. Others gripped silver spoons, ivory miniatures, lace fans folded tight. No one knew if those objects would survive the voyage. Some did. Others vanished into broken crates and seawater. Heirlooms now sleep beneath waves, names lost with them. The evacuation of loyalists was no parade. Carriages rattled through muddy alleys, wheels splashed in filth. Skirts of French damask tore at the hem. Children hugged dolls with faces cracking beneath old paint. Soldiers watched as former neighbors boarded ships bound for Canada, England, the Bahamas. Luxury left with them. A harpsichord packed too quickly arrived scratched. A porcelain tea service rimmed in gold was wrapped in shirts. A ship's manifest read, "Household effects. Value uncertain." Who played that harpsichord again? Who drank from those cups? In Boston, loyalist mansions were locked and left. Auctioneers arrived with ledgers and mallets. Velvet curtains stiff with dust were pulled open. Silver candlesticks lifted, their bases blackened with wax. One portrait of the king, cracked across the face, lay untouched. Crowds gathered, a mirror changed hands, a bolt of damask unrolled like water. A snuff box, chipped but luminous, passed into the pocket of someone who asked no questions. Absence gained currency. A diary surfaced in Philadelphia. Its last line read, "We leave by morning. The trunks are, the rest was missing. Pages had been torn. Was it fear or choice?" Receipts listed what was left behind. 12 mahogany chairs, one set of silver engraved, a child's shoe of ivory, a fan no one claimed. In New York, crates rattled as ships pulled from the wharves. One held a book of psalms, a ribbon, and a portrait of a man unnamed. No stories traveled with them, only weight. Some crates are now sealed in archives. Others broke open mid-crossing. A mirror shattered, a diary sold, a name erased. Would you open the box if it arrived at your door? If the spoon still held its initials, but not its voice, would you keep it? Let me know in the comments. Doors opened slowly in 1784. Brass keys turned in locks untouched since the first alarms. Light fell across rooms draped in sheets, dust catching like breath in sun. In Newport, a handbill curled on a courthouse wall. Estate sale, household goods, books, one desk with secret drawers, sundry items of silver. Inside, beeswax polish bloomed under cloth, releasing a sweetness that couldn't hide the must of time. A walnut desk stood near a window. Its lid bore a rubbed patch where hands had once rested. A false panel gave way to air, then to something else. A ring coiled around a lock of hair, 2 coins, a Bible scrap with one line scrubbed nearly through. A birth or a death, no one could tell. In Charleston, light poured into a parlor sealed for years. A mirror foxed with age reflected dust where portraits had hung. Watered silk curtains hung stiff. A Sevres saucer cracked up the side. On the mantel, a tortoiseshell comb waited, forgotten but unbroken. In Philadelphia, probate clerks read lists aloud in rooms smelling of ink and scorched wax. One tea caddy, contents uncertain. 4 spoons, marked J.M. A book with title leaf removed. No one asked why. In the Hudson Valley, a farmer opened a crate. Linen, a faint scent of cloves, a brass sextant wrapped in flannel. Beneath it, a map of the river marked with hand-drawn X's, ice crossings during the winter of '79. The last X vanished off the edge of the paper. A widow nearby opened a chest lined with camphor. "Keep the ring," she told her daughter. "Sell the rest." The girl held the chain tight enough to leave crescents in her palm. The ring stayed. Auctions replaced sermons. The crier's voice rose lot by lot. 2 Chippendale chairs were parted. A hairwork brooch, unnamed, pinned to a stranger's dress. Libraries, too, bore their erasures. Bookplates scraped clean. Notes scrawled in margins without author. A page dated April 12th, 1776, stood alone between torn leaves. No explanation. In New York, A watchmaker smoothed leather across a counter. The case he stitched would hold a replacement for a timepiece lost during the Troubles. The new watch bore a tiny nick near the crystal. "River stones," the owner said, and said no more. In Williamsburg, a portrait once bricked into a hearth came back into light. King George's eyes stared, dulled beneath grime. "Do we hang it?" someone asked. "Not yet." Mystery moved among the polished. A ring from a Providence cistern. A trunk delivered with the wrong clothes, the wrong name, the wrong century. A seamstress pricked her finger, leaving a red dot on silk. Her apprentice sucked the stain away. No need to mark more than necessary. Peace arrived not in speeches, but in hands smoothing linen, brushes lifting ash, candles placed carefully between mirrors. But under floorboards, behind panels, inside secret drawers, the war kept breathing. A ribbon, a spoon, a page torn from a book. 2 years after peace, markets filled with the strange detritus of war. In Boston, auctioneers laid out tables in rooms that smelled of tobacco smoke and tallow. Silver spoons clinked against pewter, lace collars yellowed at the edges, and books whose margins bore inked notes in hands no one could trace. One catalogue listed simply, 12 chairs, origin unknown. They were mahogany, carved with shells and vines, polished so deeply they mirrored candle flames. Whose table had they stood around? Which arguments had those seats held in silence? In New York, traders carried crates into cellars that still smelled of salt from the sea. One was pried open to reveal a French porcelain service, cups rimmed in gilt, saucers painted with roses. None bore initials. No ledger connected them to a name. Farther south, Charleston streets rang with hammers repairing houses long vacant. From attics came trunks left behind, a velvet riding habit chewed by moths, a child's ivory rattle, a box of playing cards stained with wine. The cards' painted faces had blurred, yet the Queen of Hearts still looked up with a faint smile. Mysteries threaded through these objects. In Philadelphia, a diary surfaced at a sale, its leather cover cracked, its lock broken. Inside, pages were intact until 1779, when the entries ended with, "We leave by morning." The trunk, sir. The ink stopped mid-word. The next leaves were blank, and not only blank, some were torn away, leaving ragged edges. Were they destroyed by chance or by design? Luxury continued to return, though often without context. An ormolu clock ticked on a mantel in Virginia, its gilt mounts shining though the parlor still smelled of soot. A French fan, silk-pleated and painted with pastoral scenes, was carried in a New England wedding, though the family could not say how it had crossed the ocean. One officer wrote in his journal after attending such a wedding, "We danced in a house with no windows unbroken, yet they placed Venetian glass upon the table. We drank from cups more traveled than the men who held them. Objects had crossed seas, names had not. Sometimes silence shouted louder than presence. A spoon without initials, a chair without provenance, a diary without conclusion. Would you hold such an item as treasure, or feel it ache in your hands as absence? By 1786, peace had settled into households in uneven ways. Some rooms glowed again with beeswax polish and curtains of imported silk. Others stood hollow, their plaster cracked, their mantels bare. The war had not left evenly. In Boston, lawyers read wills in chambers smelling of ink and candle smoke. Quills scratched across parchment, voices low and deliberate. To my eldest son, the house and lot, a pause. To my daughter, the silver spoons engraved with our name. The cadence was steady, almost liturgical, yet often the objects listed in probate could not be found. A spoon missing, a mirror already sold, a ledger erased before the ink dried. In Charleston, a trunk was opened after a decade sealed. Inside, gowns folded with precision lay brittle, their fabric moth-eaten, their perfume faint but sharp, as if it had waited in the dark. Among them, a fan painted with pastoral scenes, its ivory sticks cracked but intact. A note in the trunk read only, "Keep for memory." No signature. Virginia estates fared differently. At Mount Vernon, Washington walked through his halls again. The smell of cedar oil lingered in corridors lined with books, their leather spines gleaming in lamplight. Imported china stood arranged in cabinets. The rooms looked whole, but beneath the polish lay silences. Letters were missing from files, pages torn from weather logs, names absent in lists. Not all memory had been kept. Up the Hudson, auctions turned inheritance into contest. Brothers argued over chairs carved with shell motifs. Sisters disputed who should keep a silver locket. The auctioneer's hammer fell with a sharp crack, breaking family ties as easily as it broke lots. And yet some objects refused to move. A portrait nailed to a wall in a farmhouse was too large to lift, its frame of gilded gesso crumbling, but still clinging to plaster. Families lived around it in silence, neither claiming nor discarding it. The eyes stared outward, a king turned into a ghost. Elsewhere, items surfaced without provenance. A watch inscribed with initials no one recognized. A pewter dish with a crest scratched until unrecognizable. An ivory miniature of a woman, her features delicate, her name never written. Did families choose to forget, or had time erased beyond choice? By the close of 1786, ledgers across the states recorded more assets than battles, more inheritances than casualties. Yet even in their detail, silence remained. Pages showed blank spaces where names should have stood, red lines striking through what once had meaning. Some inheritances brought wealth, others grief. Some objects returned to daily use, others became only relics, polished, dusted, displayed, but never spoken of. The revolution had ended, but memory was still at war with forgetting. Philadelphia in the summer of 1787 was heavy with heat. The air in the streets carried the smell of horse dung, tar from wagons, and the faint sweetness of molasses spilled from casks at the docks. Flies gathered in alleys, their buzzing swallowed by the sound of bells striking from steeples. Inside the Pennsylvania State House, shutters were drawn tight against the sun. The rooms went dim, the air close, hot with the smell of wool coats, powder and wigs, and the constant burn of tallow candles. Papers rustled like whispers. Quills scratched against parchment stretched taut and pale. Some sheets bore smudges where ink had sweated in the heat. George Washington sat in the chair at the front, its crest carved with a rising sun. His hands rested still, the air around him calm, despite the fever of the room. Alexander Hamilton bent over papers stacked high, his pen racing. Benjamin Franklin shifted in his seat, his cane tapping faintly against the floor. Madison filled page after page with notes, his hand cramped but steady. The scene was not only debate, but performance. Silver inkstands gleamed on tables. Mahogany desks, polished with oil, reflected the candlelight. A crystal decanter of Madeira stood near Franklin's chair. Linen handkerchiefs, embroidered at the edge, mopped foreheads. Luxury clung, even in the sweat. But silence was its own participant. Outside, citizens gathered, pressing against shaded walls, straining to hear through shutters nailed closed. Inside, no words left the chamber. Delegates swore secrecy. Diaries from that summer often read the same. Much was discussed. I can write no more. Whole weeks are missing from the record. Objects carried what words would not. A pewter inkpot spilled during an argument, its stain still visible in the floorboards. A sheet of parchment discarded, its corner torn off, the fragment used later to wrap pins. A fan left by a delegate's wife, painted silk now folded, silent witness to a chamber never meant to be seen. When drafts were read aloud, voices cracked in the heat. Men argued, rose from chairs, paced across creaking floors. Quills snapped, replaced by new ones cut with knives kept in waistcoat pockets. Some shouted of tyranny, others murmured of compromise. At one table, a man whispered to his neighbor, "We are building with silence more than with words." The phrase went unrecorded, yet lingers like dust across the chamber still. Beyond the hall, ordinary lives unfolded in shadows of absence. Merchants sold ribbons and gloves imported from France, their shop windows glimmering with silk while the city's wells went dry. Apprentices fetched water in buckets heavy as iron, the smell of algae rising with each pull. Women starched linen, hung it to dry in gardens where bees hummed. None of these acts entered the official record. Even the final parchment bore silence. The Constitution, signed in September, gleamed with ink dark against pale skin of calf. But no women's names, no enslaved voices, no servants, soldiers, or widows. The document was whole, but its silences were louder than its words. One witness later wrote of the moment, "I felt the air shift. Men signed with confidence. But I heard absence louder than applause. Objects preserve the story differently. The rising sun chair remains, its arms worn smooth where Washington's hands had rested. Madison's notes survive, though they stop abruptly when secrecy demanded silence. Hamilton's draft pages were folded, creased, lost, then recovered decades later. The fan left in the chamber still exists, its silk faded, its handle chipped, and yet, whole conversations, whole fears, whole doubts never crossed the parchment. They slipped instead into silence. By the end of 1787, a nation had its frame, but memory had holes large enough to swallow voices. The revolution had begun with fragments hidden in cellars, sealed letters, missing pages. Even its government, born in parchment and wax, carried absence in its marrow. April 1789. New York's harbor shimmered with masts as George Washington's barge cut across the water. The oars dipped in rhythm, pulling the new president toward a city hung with banners and garlands. Church bells pealed from spires, their notes echoing against brick streets, still scarred by war. The air smelled of salt, tar, and the faint sweetness of laurel branches carried in procession. Crowds pressed close as he entered. Women wore gowns of silk trimmed in lace. Men donned coats heavy with gold braid. Hats lifted, handkerchiefs fluttered, cheers rose. Yet beneath the jubilation lay a hush, curiosity more than certainty. What kind of nation was being born? Inside Federal Hall, the ceremony unfolded in rooms draped with velvet. Carpets muffled the tread of boots polished to a mirror shine. Mahogany chairs lined the walls. A Bible was placed on a table covered with crimson cloth. Washington laid his hand on it, voice low as he took the oath. His coat of dark brown broadcloth, woven in Connecticut, brushed against the gilt edge of the Bible. Witnesses leaned forward, holding their breath. One observer later wrote, "It seemed as though the world paused. When he swore, we did not hear triumph, but solemnity." Luxury filled the space, but not without tension. The silver inkstand glinted in candlelight, yet outside the hall, shopkeepers whispered of debts unpaid. Lace gloves waved from balconies, while in alleys behind the crowd, beggars lingered unnoticed. The nation's symbols were satin and silver, but the silence around them was as present as the cheers. A procession followed. Musicians played beneath awnings striped in blue and white, the smell of roasted meat wafting from stalls, the sharp tang of gunpowder drifting from salutes fired into the air. Washington bowed slightly, his face grave. He was cheered as a hero, yet his eyes betrayed the weight of something heavier. The memory of soldiers half-starved at Valley Forge, the silence of names never written in ledgers, the absence of whole voices in the Constitution he had sworn to uphold. Objects recorded what the words did not. The crimson velvet of the table cover still survives, its fabric worn thin at the edges where hands rested. The Bible remains, pages creased from his touch. A button from his coat, fallen during the procession, was retrieved by a child who kept it in a box lined with linen. These fragments outlasted the moment, carrying weight even when memory faltered. Yet absence was woven into the spectacle. No enslaved voice stood in Federal Hall that day. No women signed the oaths. Native peoples were not present, though the land beneath every shoe belonged first to them. What was not said, not shown, was as powerful as what gleamed in velvet and silver. The first inauguration ended with music fading into twilight. Bells slowed, crowds dispersed, and torches smoked against the dark. A silence settled across the city once the banners were folded, once the velvet was stored, once the Bible closed. The nation had its president, but it also carried its omissions. And in that balance, between velvet and silence, between cheers and absence, the Republic began. A pianoforte sounded behind a half-open door, not loud, just scales climbing, then slipping. The keys were ivory, cool under a girl's fingers. The cabinet, a new thing from London, with satinwood veneers that caught the afternoon. Philadelphia in 1790 wore polish like a decision. The capital had moved south. Streets smelled of fresh lime on brick, molasses at the docks, and horse sweat baking on stone. Shop windows on 2nd Street glittered with imported glass, blue and white china stacked in towers, ribbons braided in French colors that faded when left too long in light. Inside one parlor, chairs in the latest federal fashion stood around a table of mahogany, rubbed with oil until it reflected candle flame. A looking glass above the mantel deepened the room, throwing back damask in bands of pale green. On the sideboard, decanters of Madeira and claret rested in silver stands shaped like vines. A ladle lay beside a crystal bowl where the wine's edge tinted the glass rose. The air held beeswax, citrus peel, and a trace of smoke from the kitchen hearth. Down the hall, a desk stood open. Ledgers lined in marbled paper recorded cargoes, sugar, coffee, tea. Columns neat under the edge of a steel nib. One page stopped mid-sum. The next leaf had been cut close to the stitching. No remark explained why. A ribbon marker hung where the paper should have been, limp as a tongue stilled mid-word. Letters traveled along with goods. A note in a tight, elegant hand spoke of Mr. Hamilton's plan, of duties and banknotes, of figures that promised to hold a nation together if names would sign. The paper smelled faintly of tobacco and a gentleman's pomade. On the desk, a seal lay in a pool of cooled wax, red as a berry. New York did not surrender its shine. On Pearl Street, a merchant spread out shawls woven fine enough to pass through a ring. He lifted one, silver gray, and for a breath the stall looked like weather. Behind him, a crate from Bristol yielded a tea service marked only with a crown and a number. No family crest, no initials. The salesman called it new, though the hairline in one cup said otherwise. Articles returned from somewhere, carrying their silences like luggage. In Charleston, carpenters fitted new stair rails that curled like shells. A gilded girandole was lifted into its place between two tall windows, lenses multiplying flame into a small constellation. Guests admired the sparkle, their voices soft as lace moved against skin. A boy in livery set cups on a tray, his face unreadable. The porcelain chimed softly against the silver. The porter's name never entered the household books, though his handwriting appeared in the margins tallying bottles. Receipts accumulated. One carpet from Wilton, crimson ground, border with leaves. 2 candlesticks, bright finish. 6 knives, bone hafts. Sums were written, tallied, settled. Below them, sometimes a short line crossed the page and a single word, paid. Sometimes just air. In the back rooms of a Society Hill row house, trunks exhaled cedar when opened. A gown of striped taffeta unfolded like water. Its hem bore a faint stain the color of wine. Beside it lay a small locket with a curl of hair and a folded scrap reading only for safekeeping. No name. A shopkeeper near Christchurch uncrated books from London, Addison, Pope, a little Plutarch bound in calf. He turned the flyleaf to affix his ticket and found another pasted underneath, half torn, a different name lost to the knife. He pressed his own over it. The cover closed with a dull thud that sounded, somehow, like a decision. Early 1792, the mince presses clattered on 7th Street, striking metal into eagles and liberty caps. Men held the new coins up to the light, as if the sun would tell them whether trust could be alloyed. The pieces were warm from the dye. They cooled quickly. Summer carried 2 faces. In drawing rooms, card tables unfolded, their green bays smelling faintly of dust and lemon. Hands fanned spades and hearts, while voices drifted. A mention of a dinner where maps were spread and the residents chosen. A speculation about canals. A toast to credit as fragile as glass. Then the windows latched against heat and flies, and the talk slid into weather. And in 1793 the city learned another silence. The air thickened with fever. Streets emptied. Shutters latched. Pianos went quiet. Ledgers missed weeks. A tray in one house stood where it had been left, a glass ring marking the wood, the silver tongs askew. Outside, handbills fluttered against posts until the ink washed down in rain. When the air cooled, life resumed in uneven patches. Upholsterers returned with needles and webbing. Carpenters planed scarred banisters smooth. Chandlers delivered candles that gave rooms back their shadows. A man brought home a mirror that had crossed the ocean in a crate padded with straw. He hung it where a wall still showed the outline of something that had been taken down long ago. The new glass threw the room backward and offered nothing for what the old frame once held. By the close of the decade, inventories thickened as homes filled. Sideboards, beakers, clocks, carpets, prints. A nation had learned to dress its rooms. Some doors closed on polish, others closed on quiet. And the ledgers, even when balanced, carried pages that did not add up. A gap where a page should be. A curl of hair with no name. a crest scratched thin on pewter. Objects prospered. Voices did not always follow. In those first years, the Republic learned how to shine. It also learned how to keep what it would not say. The revolution had ended, but its echoes threaded through every ledger, every parlor, every silence. By the 1790s, America polished itself for display. Mahogany sideboards gleamed with oil, clocks ticked in gilt cases, and velvet curtains softened light across parlors where voices debated a republic still uncertain. Yet, in the quiet corners, absences persisted. Diaries stopped mid-line. Letters sealed in wax were never opened. Portraits remained hidden in crates beneath floorboards, their faces turned to wood rather than to memory. Even Washington's weather logs carried torn pages, days erased as if the atmosphere itself had slipped into silence. Objects endured where names did not. A child's shoe carved from ivory, auctioned without provenance. A silver spoon, initials cut deep but untraceable. A fan painted with pastoral scenes, its silk folded, its owner forgotten. They survive as fragments, luxury stripped of story, relics polished but voiceless. The nation raised its symbols, parchment signed in Philadelphia, broadcloth coats cut in American mills, coins struck with eagles bright from the press. Still, beneath the ceremony lay mystery. What was lost in crates never reopened? What remained erased in ledgers struck through with red? What memories slipped away the moment a name was crossed out? The revolution gave independence, but it also left us with silence, with absences louder than words. If these fragments speak to you, if the sealed letters, the vanished names, the portraits hidden under floors feel as haunting as victory itself, then stay with us. Because next time we open a different page, the next video, what they never taught about the American Revolution, not banners and fireworks, but betrayals, silences, and the things the ledgers refuse to keep. So, if you've journeyed this far, let us know your thoughts in the comments. What would you keep sealed, and what would you reveal? And if you want more, like, subscribe, and turn the page with us. The next silence is waiting.